Silence beneath the sea of shadows. In 2028, humanity once again looked at the moon not as a symbol, but as a territory of the future. Officially, the United States was launching the Ares-Luna mission, the first expedition intended not just to land on the surface, but to begin construction of the first semi-stationary colony near the lunar South Pole. Unofficially, everyone in government offices knew better. China had already prepared several crews, and their delay was only due to issues with new methane engines in the upper stages. The space race smelled not of prestige, but of haste. The five-person crew had been in training for years. Colonel Adrian Voss, mission commander, former U.S. Space Force test pilot, a man of cold discipline and almost mathematical precision. Maya Chen, engineer of closed-loop life support systems, specialist in inflatable dome deployment, regolith shielding, and autonomous power systems. Dr. Olena Alvarez, planetologist and geocryologist specializing in the search for ice, volatiles, and the geometry of subsurface tunnels. Dr. Samir Okafor, crew physician, biologist, and extremophile specialist, tasked with monitoring not only human health, but also any anomalous organics. And Captain Marcus Reed, military specialist in security, autonomous reconnaissance, and contingency operations in hostile environments. They were chosen not just for their knowledge, they were chosen for their ability to remain unbroken where every valve, every bolt, and every breath separates a human from death. 24 hours before launch, they gathered at the military base near the spaceport. That evening, the air was warm, almost still, and strangely earthly. It smelled of aviation fuel, wet concrete after the evening watering, and a human anxiety that no instrument can detect. Relatives stood behind the safety zone. Some smiled tensely. Others tried to memorize faces. Some held their hands to their chests, as if trying to keep their hearts inside. Maya looked at her father for a long time, a man who hadn't cried even when her mother died of cancer. Now there was moisture in his eyes. Samir said to her quietly, "The hardest thing in space isn't the vacuum, it's that no one can hug you when you're scared." She nodded, but said nothing. The launch was set for 5 in the morning. The window was narrow. Atmospheric turbulence, wind shears, tank temperatures, the docking schedule with the trans-lunar injection module, everything had to align within minutes. The rocket stood on the launch pad like a vertical city of steel, composites, and cryogenic pipelines. Frost lines ran along its hull. Liquid oxygen and methane slowly boiled in the tanks, releasing plumes of white vapor into the darkness. At 4:31, the crew began boarding. At 4:59, the hatch was closed. At 4:59, Earth ceased to be home and became mission control. The cabin smelled of plastic, electronics, and the faint metallic tang of hermetic seals. Each seat was molded to a specific body. Every strap was tightened to the limit so that the spine wouldn't suffer microtrauma during launch. The suits remained in internal standby, not yet hermetically sealed, but with active telemetry, pulse, saturation, CO2, skin temperature, hydration, and EKG. "Ares-Luna 1, ready for terminal count," a voice came from Earth. "Copy, ready," Voss replied. 40 seconds before launch, the structure around them came to life. Pumps reached maximum power. The first stage turbopumps roared like a giant beast. At T0, the rocket didn't jump into the sky. It first seemed to press them into the Earth, and then it began to rise slowly, unnaturally, upward. Maya felt the vibration travel through her bones. Samir mechanically monitored the numbers on the biomonitor. Olena, who had joked the most during training, was now silent, staring straight ahead. Reed smiled with the corner of his mouth, as if the launch was just another operation. A few minutes later, they entered Earth's orbit. There, in the black space, they docked with a propulsion module equipped with a short-cycle nuclear-electric tug, an experimental system that cut the flight to the moon in nearly half. Not hours, as journalists like to write, but not the old 3 days either. The technology gave them the edge they had hurried for. The flight was tense but nominal. They slept in snatches, ate compressed rations, checked systems, and listened to the voices from mission control, with a typical delay of just over a second each way, enough for every phrase to lose its human warmth and sound like an echo. When the moon finally appeared in the window, it wasn't romantic. It was massive, cold, and utterly indifferent. Sunlight cut its surface like a knife. One part of the craters shone white, while the other fell into such black shadow that it seemed a piece of reality had been cut out. The landing took place in the South Pole region, on a ridge between areas of eternal light and eternal darkness. This was the logic behind the future base. The sun almost never set over the horizon, providing stable energy for solar fields, while orbital spectrometers suggested water ice might lie in the shadows of craters and canyons. When the landing module's struts touched the regolith, a short, dull thud filled the cabin. Contact light, engine shutdown. On Earth, applause erupted. On the moon, silence fell. "Houston, this is Ares-Luna 1, Voss said, his voice trembling slightly despite himself. "We have landed." The first 2 hours were spent on protocol, checking seals, tank status, external cooling loops, antennas, landing struts, and radars. Then EVA. When they stepped outside, the moon deafened them not with sound, but with absence. In a vacuum, nothing rustles, whistles, or echoes, only your own breath, the suit's pumps, the rustle of water circulating through the tubes of the cooling garment, and the dull thud of boots on dust, which wasn't actually dust, but abrasive glass from micrometeorites. The sun hung above the horizon, low, blinding, with harsh atmosphere-free light. Far above the edge of the black sky, Earth shimmered like a blue-white drop. Olena was the first to deploy the lunar rover, a 6-wheeled pressurized vehicle with independent suspension, active tilt compensation, lithium-sulfur batteries, a backup fuel cell, and heating for critical components. Maya checked the fastenings of the containers with sections of the inflatable dome, cable reels, a kilopower mini-reactor, a water electrolyzer, and regolith oxygen extractor, and robotic manipulators. They didn't just have to find water, they had to prove that humans could stay here for a long time. Samir checked the airlock's bioshield, sterile containers, and sampling modules. There wasn't supposed to be life on the moon, but in science there is a rule: nature is not obliged to respect the human word "supposed to." That was when Olena noticed a strange detail. In the container compartment, covered by a thermal blanket, lay 2 long, dark cases that weren't in the official cargo manifest. She looked up at Voss and Reed. "What is this?" Reed flipped the lid. Inside lay vacuum-sealed carbines of an unusual design, short, massive, with dual recoil compensators. "Safety measures," Reed replied. "From whom?" asked Maya sharply. "From the dust?" Voss didn't look her in the eye. "In case of unforeseen situations." Olena wanted to say something more, but at that moment, Mission Control requested they begin the march to the canyon, and everyone, though with a heavy heart, returned to work. The descent into the canyon took over 4 hours. They drove slowly, though the low gravity gave an illusion of lightness. On the moon, you cannot trust any illusion. Sharp rock edges could pierce the outer layer of a spacesuit. Temperature shifts reached hundreds of degrees between lit and shaded areas. Electrostatically charged dust clung to joints, cameras, and seals. Every 20 minutes, Maya checked the temperature of the wheel motors and axle wear. Samir tracked the crew's fatigue. Dehydration in a suit is treacherous, and the heart behaves differently in 1/6 G, as if the body is resting, but in reality it loses its orientation to load. The canyon opened suddenly. It didn't look like a crack, it looked like a wound cut into the moon. The walls dropped down in ledges, where black bands of ancient basalt alternated with light zones of impact melt. In permanent shadow, the temperature dropped so low that infrared sensors showed values close to cryogenic. And where models predicted ice, there was no glint of ice. Instead, a honeycomb system of giant tunnels, as if the rock had been eaten away by some massive chemical reaction. "This is impossible," Olena whispered. "Natural sublimation doesn't create this kind of geometry." She pulled up models on the screen. Natural ice cavities are chaotic. This was orderly. Repeating radii, almost identical wall thickness, angles close to the optimal for mechanical stress relief. "Like someone carved the rock, knowing its yield strength," Maya said softly. Reed didn't even look back. "Moving into the main tunnel." "We haven't performed remote mapping yet," Olena protested. "There's no time." "Who decided that?" "I did." Reed's voice was so level it carried a sense of danger. They drove into the tunnel. Here, everything changed. The sun was left behind. Flashlights cut the darkness in narrow cones. The ceiling was lost high above, sometimes tens of meters up, sometimes dropping nearly onto the cabin. The walls shimmered with ice inclusions, not a solid mass, but veins, drops, frozen pockets. Because of the vacuum, the ice didn't melt, only slowly evaporated. But in the deepest, coldest zones, it had held for millions of years. And then, in the darkness to the right, a white light suddenly flashed. Not a reflection, not a technical artifact, a directed beam, like a searchlight. The rover stopped so abruptly that the container fastenings clattered through the hull. "No one moves," Voss said. Reed was already opening the outer module hatch. "It's impossible," Maya repeated, but now her voice was like a gasp before panic. The military men stepped out first. They took the carbines off the magnetic locks and checked the bolts. In a vacuum, a weapon doesn't roar until it fires. It just exists, a black threat in the beam of flashlights. The others followed. There, behind a ledge, they saw a gate. It was as tall as a 3-story house, built directly into the monolith of the wall. From a distance, it looked carved from stone, but up close, Maya immediately noticed the surface wasn't natural. It was multi-layered, with vitreous phase inclusions and microchannels resembling vessels in bone, or the thermal distribution channels of an aerospace composite. Faint silvery sparks ran across it.
Elena turned pale, though it could only be seen in her eyes. "It's an artificial construct." Then came the first true shock. Reed pulled out not the mission's standard transmitter, but another one, compact, narrow beam, with encryption that didn't pass through the main control channel. He activated it and said briefly, "Raven actual, object confirmed. We found them." Maya spun toward Voss. "You knew?" Voss silenced for a full second. On the moon, a second is longer than on Earth. "We had intercept data, anomalous laser returns from a Chinese orbital probe, irregular thermal spikes, artificially ordered cavities. Command decided not to disclose." "Command?" Samir took a step back. "We were sent on first contact as a construction mission?" "You were sent as the most versatile group capable of surviving and reporting." "We were used," Elena whispered. At that moment, the gate came to life. The silvery sparks gathered into a geometric pattern. The surface seemed to flow inward, opening not mechanically, but through a phase shift, as if solid matter briefly lost its solidity. From the darkness behind it came light, soft, blue, unexpectedly warm-looking. And then they saw them. Tall, slender figures in something resembling translucent carapaces. Not spacesuits in the human sense, more like bioengineered shells that tightly wrapped their bodies and pulsed with a faint inner glow. Their limbs were longer than human ones, their joints doubled, their movements unnaturally fluid in the low gravity. Each head was protected by a wide, hemispherical collar where fibers shimmered like nerve bundles. The face, if it was a face, had large, dark eyes with no visible pupil and a thin, mobile membrane where a human mouth would be. Samir froze. My God. "Hold your fire," Voss said sharply. One of the creatures raised its hands, or what served as hands. A symbol of 3 concentric arcs lit on its chest. Suddenly, something clicked in the helmets of all 5. Their electromagnetic noise transitioned into an ordered signal. A wavy track appeared on the internal display. Then a distorted sound. Not hostile. Not hostile. They had learned to hijack human channels on the fly. "They're translating," Maya exhaled. Then the second blow came not from outside, but from within the team. A beam struck from a second tunnel, thin, red, unlike a laser rangefinder. It seared into Reed's shoulder and punctured his suit's outer layer. He screamed, spun around, and opened fire into the darkness. The silence of the vacuum didn't carry the roar, but a wave of vibration passed through the ground into Maya's arm. 3 more figures leapt from the tunnel, in dark human spacesuits without American markings. "The Chinese!" Olena shouted. The unofficial second mission. They were here earlier or had landed in another sector and tracked the Americans. One of them threw a sphere. It hit a rock and released a cloud of metallic needles, which, in the vacuum, didn't disperse like a gas, but flew in a cone of inertial microprojectiles. 2 needles slammed into the side of the rover. Then the incredible happened. The creatures by the gate did not attack the humans. Instead, one of them raised a hand, and between it and the team, a thin, iridescent film appeared, like a standing wave. The needles hit it, and, losing velocity, fell. "Take cover," Voss yelled. A firefight broke out. Human weapons on the moon worked with terrifying efficiency. Pressurized cartridges spat out tungsten flechettes, stabilized by rotation. The recoil was dampened by countermass, otherwise the shooter would be spun around in the low gravity. Each shot kicked up clouds of regolith that hung slowly, as if the scene was happening underwater. The Chinese group tried to break through to the gate. They wanted the same thing as the American command: proof, technology, control. The gate, as if reacting to human aggression, released dozens of thin, light filaments from its sides. They struck the tunnel walls, and the entire rock formation shuddered. Not an explosion, something more precise, harsher, resonant excitation, an engineering masterpiece. Not destruction by force, but a transition of the material into a mode of controlled fracture along existing boundaries. "They're collapsing the tunnel," Maya screamed. The ceiling cracked. Boulders tore away slowly, almost beautifully, drifting down in 1/6 of Earth's weight, but their mass was lunar, and their inertia was real. Voss grabbed Maya by the forearm and pulled her toward the gate. Samir jumped after Elena. Reed, clutching his punctured shoulder, fired back until the last moment. One of the Chinese astronauts didn't make it. A stone ledge the size of a truck crushed him against the wall. There was no scream in the vacuum, only the impact. The gate closed behind the 5 Americans and the 2 creatures. The outer tunnel was cut off by the cave-in.
Inside, there was no vacuum. The airlock chamber filled with a thick, cold atmosphere, unsuitable for immediate breathing, but a real gas with slowly rising pressure. Suit automation shrieked because of external sensors. Maya watched with wide eyes as frost formed on her helmet's visor. Nitrogen, argon, traces of oxygen, and something else, Samir read from the analyzer. No, this isn't natural. This is a technogenic environment. They were led further. The underground city of the moon was not a city in the human sense. It was a network of cavities, bridges, glowing collectors, vertical shafts, and domes built into ancient lava tubes and ice stone pockets. Light didn't pour from lamps. The walls themselves glowed, as if bioluminescent fluids ran through them. Matte films grew on the bulkheads, not plants, but colonies of something between lichen and a factory. Photosensitive, but not photosynthetic. They gathered energy not just from light, but from the temperature difference between warm technical channels and the eternally cold rock. Samir could barely breathe from wonder. This isn't natural biology. This is directed evolution, or design, in a closed ecosystem. The creatures brought them to a hall in the center of which hung a transparent sphere with slowly rotating fractal structures inside. There, the translation turned on again. "You arrived early," said a synthetic voice. "Not the time of opening." "Who are you?" Voss asked. A pause, as if the system were searching for a word. "In your tongue, the keepers of the deep." "Are you living beings from the moon?" "We are descendants of those who arrived long ago, very long ago, not born here initially, modified for life here." There was the biological truth, not a local evolutionary miracle, but a civilization of settlers who had spent millennia re-engineering themselves for the moon. They explained in snatches. Their ancestors arrived in an era when humanity was still learning to fire clay. They sought a quiet place to hide, far from a catastrophe in their own system. The moon had no atmosphere, no oceans, but it had stable, deep cavities, ice, minerals, helium-3, low seismicity, and most importantly, isolation. They built a closed civilization in the depths using thermal reactors, geometrically optimized ice reservoirs, catalysis, and living materials that could self-repair. "Why didn't you show yourselves?" Olena asked. "Young species do with discovery, first weapon, then politics, then ruins." Maya glanced at Reed, and he looked away. But the peace didn't last long. Signals flashed on the main display. One of the surviving Chinese astronauts on the surface had managed to activate an autonomous drilling charge. It had been planted to gain access to the gate from the outside. If the charge fired, the upper ice-porous chambers would collapse. For the city, this meant not just destruction, but the depressurization of a massive sector. "They think they are cutting you off," the creature's translator said quietly. "In reality, they will kill many of our own." "We can stop it," Maya said immediately. Voss looked at her. "It's suicide." "No, it's engineering. If I can get to the power collector, I can redirect your resonance array into antiphase. We'll scramble the detonation guidance frequency." One of the creatures approached her. Its eyes were black and deep, but in them one could read not coldness, but experience. "You see the system, not just the fear. I'm an engineer." "Then come."
They moved through the lower passages. This was no longer just a retreat. It was a race beneath the lunar surface. Then came the fourth unexpected event. In a side bioreactor hall, Samir noticed something in the depths of a translucent tank that looked like knotted, glowing roots. He brought his scanner close, and it reacted to complex organic polymers with an informational structure. Not DNA, not RNA, but something parallel, built for low temperatures and high radiation. This was the biological foundation of the Keepers. Not just vegetation, but the ecosystem's memory, a living library. At that second, a shock ran through the system. The Chinese charge had already begun drilling. The ceiling trembled. A jet of supercooled gas hissed from a crack in the stone. Olena lost her footing and hit her helmet against a support rib. A warning flashed on her indicator. A micro crack in the outer visor. "She has a limited reserve," Samir shouted. "Keep moving," Voss ordered. They reached the central power hub. Maya understood the principle at a glance. These weren't generators in the human sense, but a thermodynamic network that drew energy from the temperature gradient between the reactor core and natural cold traps. A massive amount of heat was dumped into special ice massives, and the return came through superconducting lines into converters. The efficiency was incredible, specifically because of the near-absolute cold surrounding them. "It's genius," she exhaled. "You have 2 minutes," Voss said. Maya connected a human diagnostic module to the alien panel via a field interface adapter. The protocols didn't match. She worked almost by instinct, at the level of principles, not commands. Unfamiliar symbols flashed on the screen, but physics is the same for all civilizations. Resonance, inverse phase signal, load distribution across nodes, peak suppression. "Come on, come on!" Then the drilling charge fired. Everything around them buckled. Somewhere above, tons of rock and ice shifted downward. Energy lines flashed blindingly. Maya was thrown back from the panel, but the system had accepted the command. A wave passed through the city that made everyone's teeth click. The anti-phase worked only partially. They had taken the main blow, but one node overloaded, and that node was directly above them. The bulkhead snapped. A piece of composite ice vault the size of a car came hurtling down. Voss managed to push Olena out of the way. Reed yanked Maya by her safety tether. Samir covered the biological container he was carrying with his head, but Reed didn't make it. The boulder hit his legs and pinned him to the floor. Mass on the moon is lighter, but not enough to forgive that. His pelvis and both legs were crushed. A red cascade lit up inside his suit. Internal bleeding, a sharp pulse spike, a drop in pressure. "I can't feel my legs," he said hoarsely. Samir rushed to him. "Hold on, look at me. Don't drift off." Voss helped lift the fragment with a manipulator jack, while Maya, her shoulder throbbing with pain, blocked the damaged energy channel. Reed grabbed Voss by the wrist. "Adrian, listen. Command knew more. Not just about the anomalies. They intercepted an old signal even before China. They didn't want contact. They wanted the technology of supremacy. I was supposed to ensure the extraction." "Shut up," Voss said sharply, but his voice held no anger, only a late, heavy truth. "If I survive, I'll testify," Reed whispered. Samir administered an auto-infusion, a hemostat, and a microdose of anesthetic, just enough not to stop his breathing. On Earth, this was already a critical surgery. On the moon, it was almost a death sentence. "He won't last long without surgery," Samir said. "We need to get to the surface, now." The creatures looked at the humans without the usual human facial expressions, but one of them handed Samir a small transparent cylinder. "Biostasis fluid. It will temporarily slow tissue degradation." "Can you save him?" "Not in our environment. Your body needs your air, your gravity, your tools." "And us?" Olena asked. "Are we supposed to leave after all this?" The translator stood silent for a long time. Then it replied, You already know about us. Now the question is not whether you leave, the question is whether you return as invaders." Then the lead creature approached the transparent sphere in the center of the hub. A small polyhedron, like a crystal with liquid light inside, detached from it. "This is a record, history, biology, the geometry of this place, proof. Take it and testify correctly." Voss accepted the crystal with both hands as if it were something sacred.
The way back to the surface became the final trial. The main tunnel was blocked. The keepers opened an old evacuation sleeve leading to another vertical shaft. It exited far from the landing site, right on the edge of the light ridge. From there, they still had to reach the landing module. They pulled Reed on a sled with a complex damping frame. In low gravity, it was possible, but every sharp movement tossed his body, causing new pain. Samir constantly adjusted the infusion. Maya held the container with the crystal and an emergency data block to her chest. Olena, despite a micro-crack in her helmet, led the way with navigation. Voss covered the rear. When they reached the surface, the horizon was already burning with harsh light. The sun skated low, casting shadows kilometers long. Far off, at the limit of visibility, stood their landing module, small, fragile, like a toy, but in reality, their only way home. Then a signal appeared on the sensors. One Chinese astronaut had survived. His suit was damaged, and one jetpack thruster was firing in fits and starts, but he was heading for the American ship by a shorter route. If he reached it first and damaged the ascent module, no one would leave. "I'll stall him," Voss said. "Alone?" Maya gasped. "You don't have time to argue." Olena grabbed his sleeve. "Don't do anything stupid." "It's not stupidity, it's mathematics." He moved aside, using his maneuvering pack. In 1/6 gravity, a person moves strangely, not running, but leaping in long, silent arcs. Two soldiers on a dead moon were converging like the shadows of two civilizations. Voss intercepted the Chinese astronaut near a rock outcrop. They exchanged fire. One flechette pierced the antenna on Voss's helmet, but didn't hit the shell. Voss replied more accurately, hitting the opponent's maneuvering unit. The man lost orientation, spun, and hit a rock. For a moment, it seemed it was over, but the Chinese astronaut raised his hand and activated a final weapon, a compact-shaped charge aimed directly at the ascent module. Voss wouldn't have reached it in time. No one would have. Then a fifth miracle happened, almost beyond human understanding. A thin wave passed over the surface, between the charge and the ship, nearly invisible, like heat haze over sun-baked metal, except there is no air on the moon. From the far edge of the canyon, through the rock, the keepers directed a final pulse of their field. The charge detonated prematurely, scattering regolith 100 meters from the landing module. Voss silently reached the Chinese astronaut, kicked away the detonator, and returned to the team. "They covered us," Olena whispered. "Yes," he said, "and we were the ones calling them dangerous." The boarding of the module became a battle of seconds. Reed was loaded last. His body temperature was already dropping, and blood, despite the drugs and biostasis fluid, was seeping into the lower layers of his suit. Samir connected the field surgical loop, oxygen, pressure, ultrasound bleeding control, pelvic auto-splint. It wasn't a cure, just a bridge to one. Maya prepared the ship for launch. Due to the tremors, one of the landing module's tank valves was sticking, and a regolith buildup on the right strut could cause an asymmetrical impulse during ascent. She was manually rewriting the purge sequence. Her hands shook. "Maya," Voss said softly, buckling into his seat. "Breathe."
If the valve hangs at 13%, the turbopump will catch a steam pocket and we'll lose thrust. If we don't zero out the axial error at launch, the left main loop will overheat before we clear 100 meters. I know. You will fix it." She nodded and closed her eyes for a second. Then she opened them, a different person. Launch. The lunar module lunged upward in a pillar of white dust, which rose in a slow curtain in the weak gravity. They passed over the canyon ridge, and at the last moment, Olena looked down. There, among the shadows and light, on the edge of the dark abyss, stood 3 tall figures, motionless, silent, older than all human space programs. She raised her hands to the viewport. "We will return, but not in the way you fear."
The docking with the orbital module was a near-run thing. Reed was no longer responding. Samir twice initiated manual resuscitation, fighting internal bleeding and crush trauma. In 0G, blood behaves differently, and any swelling compromises breathing faster. But the biostasis fluid of the alien civilization worked a miracle. His vitals didn't collapse entirely. On the way home, they didn't transmit everything to Earth. Voss forbade it. First, only a distress signal, medical priority, and confirmation that the mission had encountered an unidentified intelligent civilization. Mission Control initially thought it was the result of stress or damage. Then Maya activated the crystal. A soft light erupted in the cabin, and a 3-dimensional map of the subsurface city, biological cycles, historical sequences, mathematical records, the structures of their bodies, and genetic adaptation modules for low gravity and vacuum survival unfolded in the air. It couldn't be faked. Too complex, too cohesive, too alive. A silence fell on Earth so profound that even through the radio delay they felt it. "Ares-Luna 1, Control finally answered. The voice was different, stripped of its usual confidence. "Data received. I repeat, data received." Maya cried for the first time in the entire mission. Tears in 0G don't run down your cheeks. They gather in spheres near your eyes, distorting the world. "We are not alone," she said. "We never were," Samir replied, not taking his eyes off Reed. The return to Earth was not a triumph, but a shock to civilization. Captain Marcus Reed survived, but remained in critical condition. For the first 48 hours, doctors fought for his life in an orbital hospital module and then at a ground facility. He had to have one leg amputated above the knee. The other was being reconstructed through a series of surgeries. But he survived, and most importantly, he testified. Commander Voss handed over the records from the hidden channel. They proved that a segment of the military command knew about the high probability of artificial structures on the Moon and had planned to use the mission not just for science, but for a unilateral technological seizure. Olena published the first scientific report on the unnatural geometry of ice tunnels and subsurface engineering. Samir wrote on the biology of the Keeper's closed ecosystems and a fundamentally new type of informational polymers. Maya spoke on the thermodynamic architecture of the lunar city, which left the world's leading engineers awake at night with envy and wonder. But the most important thing happened not in labs or offices. When humanity learned that beneath the seemingly dead moon hid another civilization, not godlike, not omnipotent, not a fairy tale, but real, vulnerable, intelligent, and just as frightened by human greed, space ceased to be just a realm for expansion. It became a realm of responsibility. A month after the return, when Reed could finally speak without life support, Voss, Maya, Olena, and Samir came to his room. Outside the window, the sun was rising, earthly, soft, with a moisture in the air that doesn't exist on the moon. "I think all the time," Reed said hoarsely, "that if they hadn't covered us, we wouldn't have made it back." "Yes," Voss replied. And we flew there with weapons. Samir nodded slowly. Sometimes the first proof of another race's intelligence is that it turns out to be wiser than us. Maya walked to the window and looked into the sky, where the moon was invisible in the daylight. They gave us a chance, and now everything depends on what we turn out to be. No one answered immediately, because this was no longer just a story about a flight, not about a colony, not about a race between nations. It was a story of how humanity, stepping into someone else's silence, heard for the first time not emptiness, but someone's memory, and understood that even on the moon, the most dangerous thing you can bring from Earth is not rockets, drills, or weapons, but your own insatiability.